Hello, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first Mary Kingsley Zochonis lecture of 2021. I am Professor Ola Uduku, President of the African Studies Association of the United Kingdom. Before we start our lecture, a short introduction to the African Studies Association. The African Studies Association is the National Subject Association for Africanists within the British academic community. Its objectives are to advance African studies, particularly in the United Kingdom and also to make links with Africanists across the world. Today, the ASA UK has broadened its aims to cover promotion of African studies activities in the UK and cross-disciplinary discourses on Africa between the United Kingdom and African scholars in institutions across Africa and elsewhere. It also seeks to decentralize its traditional UK base and in its place create a multi-located presence amongst our members across Africa. Our other key aim, which is part of today, is to disseminate information and news to our members about research and other Africa-related activities. We do this by supporting African scholars who seek to publish in Africanist journals, scholarly journals, and book publishing in the United Kingdom. Furthermore, we seek to encouraging the promotion and exchange of ideas in and about Africa through conferences, symposia, and increasingly using different forms of social media. Our biennial conference, which will happen next year, will be doing this as well. So it is now my great pleasure to hand over the introduction of our speaker, who is Dr. Gibson Ncube from the University of Zimbabwe, and who will be talking about, or his subject will be, is Queerness is un-African, ? But I'm handing over to the Vice President of ASA UK, Carly Coetzee, to introduce our speaker. Thank you and enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you very much, Prof. Uduku. It is a real privilege for me to introduce Dr. Gibson Ncube, who's an Associate Professor of French in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures at the University of Zimbabwe. His academic work is positioned at the intersections of literature, cultural studies, and gender and sexuality studies. In particular, he undertakes pioneering work in the field of queer African studies. His unique scholarly expertise allows him to broaden the scope of this emerging field, no longer emerging, I think, fully emerged, bringing in Francophone and North African perspectives. He also pushes the boundaries of his field by explicitly engaging with questions of decolonizing queer studies in contemporary Africa. And I want to add, he also pushes the boundaries by being fairly unique in being able to work across Anglophone and Francophone and other epistemic and linguistic and cultural traditions. He's a widely published academic. Those of you on Twitter will see that I tweeted a small selection of his articles this afternoon. Alongside over 30 journal articles and book chapters, he's also the author of a monograph that I'm going to try and pronounce, La sexualité queer au Maghreb à travers la littérature, and is currently completing a second monograph called Queer Bodies in African Films. At present, he's the co-convener of the Queer African Studies Association, which is a coordinate and affiliate organization of the ASA. And he holds a 2021 virtual research fellowship with the University of Leeds. And I see some of his University of Leeds colleagues are in the audience. So as you can tell from the lecture, the question mark is everything. Is queerness un-African ? Queer-related subjects have a contested status in many countries on the African continent. Not only on the African continent, but that of course is our focus and his focus, both in the academy and beyond. Moreover, work in this area sometimes is regarded as marginal to African studies at large. And this too, I think, has changed significantly, partly because of Dr. Ncube's work. By inviting Dr. Ncube to deliver one of the two 2021 Mary Kingsley Zochonis lectures, the ASA recognizes the critical importance of this field of research and its significance for broader conversations regarding African cultural subjectivities, social formations, political structures, and decolonial epistemologies. We welcome you very heartily and thank you for your time, Dr. Ncube, and thank you for being here and for agreeing to be the one of the two distinguished MKZ lecturers this year.
It is a very humbling honor to be giving one of this year's Mary Kingsley Zochonis lectures. I'd like to thank Professor Adrian van Klinken for nominating me, and I'm also very thankful to the African Studies Association of the UK and the Royal African Society for selecting me to give this lecture. My lecture is entitled Queerness is unAfrican, the complexity of non-normative sexual and gender identities in Africa. In this lecture, I wish to examine the contested status of queer sexualities and gender identities in many countries of the African continent, both in the academy and beyond. Nicholas Edson rightly acknowledges that few subjects are more divisive or raise issues as disquieting as the nature of sexuality and the meaning of gender identities. And he further points out that queer sexuality is controversial not only in and in itself, but for the light it throws on society at large, often from unexpected and disturbing angles. I'll begin this lecture by playing a short clip of an interview from 2017 between CNN anchor Christian Amanpour and the President of Kenya, Mr. Uhuru Kenyatta. In this clip, one issue that is discussed is that of queer rights in Africa.
One of the major issues, and it's a holdover from sort of colonial Victorian, is the issue of sexual preference in many African countries. In Kenya, to be gay, the LGBT community is illegal. They just want to have equal rights, the same privacy and equality as all other Kenyans do. Is that something that you aspire to for your country?
I want to be very clear, Christian. I will not engage in a subject that is of no, it is not of any major importance to the people and the Republic of Kenya. This is not an issue, as you would want to put it, of human rights. This is an issue of society, of our own base as a culture, as a people, regardless of which community you come from. This is not acceptable. This is not agreeable. This is not about Uhuru Kenyatta saying yes or no. This is an issue of the people of Kenya themselves who have bestowed upon themselves a constitution, right, after several years, have clearly stated that this is not a subject that they are willing to engage in, yeah, at this time and moment. In years to come, possibly long after I'm president, who knows? Maybe our society will have reached a stage where those are issues that people are willing, freely and open to discuss. I have to be honest with you. And that is the position that we have always maintained. Those are the laws that we have, and those are laws that are 100% supported by 99% of the Kenyan people, irregardless of where they come from.
So
It's a very
you're going to get yourself into trouble because what you've categorically just stated is that this is not an issue for us, for the Kenyan people,
yes.
And you don't think that the idea of their privacy, their equality, their rights is important.
This is,
but it's a global issue right now.
It's important to them where they are.
Why is it not
I am
important
saying
to you
that it
as
is
president
not
of the country?
important to me as the leader of 49 million Kenyans. And after, if you want to ask me my personal opinion,
what is your personal opinion?
After I finish my process, I can talk about my personal opinion. But as the leader of the people of the Republic of Kenya. I represent that which our people are desirous to be. And I have no choice, but that is my position.
Would you publicly say that people who are LGBT, gay members of the Kenyan population should not be discriminated against, should not be violated, should not be abused?
No Kenyan should be abused, should be, mistreated in any particular. Every Kenyan is protected by law, every single Kenyan. But they also must recognize that their freedoms are also must be taken into the entire context of the society that they live in. Because this is not a question of governments accepting or not accepting. This is a question of society, right?
Currently, it's a legal process.
Yes. And that legal process is based on the society that you live in. And that's why laws are made. So I think that's all I have to say about that particular subject.
Three important issues emanate from this discussion. Number one, that the political structures have an influence on how queer sexualities and queer rights are considered on the African continent. Number two, the fact that queer rights have been normalized in the global north is not necessarily mean that that is the case in the global south. And number three, Amampur seems unaware in her consideration of the repression of queer rights in Kenya and indeed Africa by extension, of the role that is played by Western, especially American, evangelical churches and conservative religious NGOs in the increase of homophobic sentiments on the continent. For the purposes of this lecture, I'm interested in focusing on three central concerns. Firstly, I'd like to look at the politicization of queer sexuality on the African continent. And secondly, I look at the need to decolonize our understanding of queer sexualities. And then finally, I'd like to look at the pivotal role that is played by the creative arts in representing and archiving queer lived experiences. To begin with, it is very evident from the interview that I played between and President Kenyatta that there's a tension between the global north and the global south in as far as queer rights are concerned. President Kenyatta's sentiments echo those of other politicians on the African continent. And I'm thinking in this instance about Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni and the late former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe. In spite of the comprehensive studies that have shown that queer sexualities and gender identity predated the arrival of Europeans in Africa, many politicians have contended that sexualities represent a Western depraved import. Analyzing these nationalist sentiments by politicians, Neville Hoard explains that, and I quote him, "It may be possible to read homophobic strands in African nationalisms as displaced resistance to perceived and real encroachments on neo-colonial national sovereignty by economic and cultural globalization." Sylvia Tamale finds that in Africa, there's a close relationship between the representation of queer sexualities or queer rights and the anti-democratic upsurge. As pointed out by Tamale, in countries such as Uganda, homophobia has simply become a political tool used by conservatives to promote their self-serving agendas. The more important point to note is that anti-homosexuality rhetoric serves to strengthen the standing of its proponents in the mainstream thought and maintains their social relevance, whether it is in the West or in Africa. One of the central arguments in the politicization of queer sexuality has been to frame it as foreign to the continent. Adrian van Klinken points out in this regard that the consequences of this form of sexual politics, queer sexuality, is framed as exogenous, and that LGBTI people are denied a claim to an identity and excluded from the body of the nation. Such exclusion of the individuals who identify as queer, according to Tabona Shoko, speaks to how in Africa, politicians call them, and I'm referring here to individuals who identify as queer, politicians call them the festering finger, endangering the body of the nation. Churchmen say God wants them dead. The courts send them to jail. What the foregoing shows, however, is that queer sexualities are not foreign to the African continent. What is foreign is undeniably homophobia. In thinking through this issue of homophobia, Van Klinken explains that it speaks to the revival of racist colonial discourses which framed Africans as primitive. In Van Klinken's argument, and I quote, arguably, this anti-queer pan-Africanist narrative is based on an invented notion of African authenticity. It reflects a post-colonial revival of earlier colonialist discourses about African sexuality as fundamentally heterosexual. These discourses were informed by the racist notion of Africans as primitive, so close to nature that they could not engage in what European colonizers and missionaries at the time considered unnatural sexual transgressions. The sad irony, of course, is that politicians who are against queer rights, as they attempt to valiantly seek to protect their nations from imperialism, unwittingly, or oftentimes also willfully denying the fact that current notions of queerness, being an African, are based on Western religious and cultural mores imported during the colonization of the continent. I'll move on to the second point of my lecture, which is on the need to decolonize the ways in which we understand queer sexualities and gender identities on the African continent. Queer sexuality and gender identities have often been understood through the theoretical and methodological lenses of Western scholars such as Michel Foucault, David Halperin, Judith Butler, and many others. The very term queer is itself an invention of Western thought. The intersection and overlapping of queer and African is itself shrouded in contestation. The term queer is undeniably imbued with Western genealogies and perceptions of gender and sexuality. The question that must be asked, therefore, is whether queer as a Western mode of analysis can be neatly and readily applied in the understanding of non-normative ways of being outside of the European context or the Western context. Van Klinken warns in this regard of the problem of traveling theories developed in the so-called global north, informed by Western epistemologies and traditions of thought that are being introduced and applied to context in the so-called global south. In an introduction to the collection of short stories entitled Queer Africa, Phumla Dineo-Qola, however, explains the relevance of using the term queer in reference to African non-conforming gender and sexual identities. I quote her, "Many discussions and debates on the use of queer in African contexts are varied and ongoing. These debates have the discoveries, frustrations, excitement, and anger that come with all politically difficult conversations that are worth having. While some use the label comfortably, others are worried about whether it adequately speaks usefully to contexts outside the geographical politics of its emergence. Stella Nyanzi, on the other hand, is more radical in her thinking about what queer in Africa means and why it should not necessarily be grounded in Western ways of knowledge production. According to Stella Nyanzi, and I quote her, "Queer Africa is much more than Michel Foucault and Judith Butler. It is lazy to always start our queer African narratives with either this French philosopher or his American compatriot. Departures to Jeffrey Weeks, Dennis Altman, Gilbert Hurd, Peter Eggleton still fit into Western hegemony over queer studies. Sprinkling the menu with Audre Lorde, Sonia Correa, or Serena Nanda is commendable effort, but not nearly enough. Stretching this tapestry of authorities to include queer scholars with masculine names from the global south outside Africa would be an exercise in missing the gist of my introduction. In fact, queer Africa should transcend Mark Epprich, Rudolph Pell Guadio, Weringa Saskia, Ruth Morgan, and the bold Africanist non-Africans who generously contribute to the growth of knowledge about non-heteronormative sexual orientations and non-conforming gender identities. According to Nyanzi, it is imperative for queer African scholarship to look beyond and certainly think beyond the authority of the West and forge new ways of conceptualizing non-conforming gender and sexual identities. The importance of these sentiments cannot be underscored because, as explained by Zethu Matebeni and Thabo Msidi, language, naming, and words can be deeply political. Naming is, in this regard, a profoundly political enterprise in designating African non-normative gender and sexual identity. However, the use of the term queer is itself not without some problems. The question to ask, though, is what are the implications of using such a Western-centered term and epistemology to understand historical contexts and lived experiences that are themselves not Western? It is also worth asking what is lost in using Western epistemologies and knowledge systems in making sense of non-conforming African sexualities and gender identities. Cognizant of these complex realities, I think the term queer, imbued with its Western-rooted knowledge systems, can be a productive term in thinking about African non-conforming sexualities and identities. As highlighted by Zethu Matebeni and Jabu Pereira, queer has become synonymous with another problematic term, LGBTI, an acronym that has hidden the crucial diversities within a conflated group of people. The longer such acronyms continue circulating, the deeper the challenges faced by the invisibilized groups such as transgender people will continue. The term queer is thus important in imagining the diverse non-normative gender and sexual identities, especially in view of the paucity of terms and vocabularies in Africa that positively capture identities that do not fall within the heterosexual category. The term queer is, in my view, a viable locution that speaks usefully to non-normative gender and sexual identity and experiences on the African continent. Finally, on this question of decolonizing theories and methodologies in queer African studies, I evoke the ideas of Grace Mosela, who warns against the wholesale attempts to erase and replace Western modes of thinking with so-called African ones. Mosela expresses this predicament in such words: I'm invested in the promise of decolonial praxis, but I worry about the dangers of parochialism. This danger not only comes from shunning non-African bodies of knowledge, but is also extended to blind spots that are created when we fetishize the novelty of our struggles. And the supposed novelty, actually, one may say, not realizing that some of the wheels that we're trying to invent have already been invented by other forerunners and fellow travelers elsewhere. Mosela further explains that it is possible to dismantle the hierarchies that continue to inferiorize African knowledges without rejecting so-called Northern or Eurocentric knowledge wholesale. When we reject bodies of ideas based on who is producing them or where or the location they're being produced, we sometimes end up disowning our contributions to the body of knowledge. I move on to the final angle of my lecture, which is looking at the role that is played by creative arts in imagining queer sexualities and identities in Africa. I would like to play a short musical clip by multi-talented South African queer artist. The song is called Clairvoyant, and I should point out that this music video contains some scenes of nudity.
When I close my eyes, I saw prairies.
Nakani's musical, literary, and filmic body of work represents contemporary portrayals of queer lived experiences in Africa. In the video that I've just played, there's a bold portrayal of queer bodies, their intimacy, and their eroticism. Nakani explains in a 2014 interview that, and I quote, "My work is an extension of who I am, no censorship allowed." So basically, that means my entire being, whether it's flattering or not, and in most of the time it is not, is put into my work. My sexuality is a facet of who I am, so naturally it plays a part. What this highlights is how contemporary creative artists use their diverse art forms as means of queer activism. In addition to activism, the creative arts, literature, music, photography, etc., have played and continue to play an important role in making visible and knowable queer experiences in Africa, against the background in which political fiat has the power to render invisible queer lived experiences. The creative arts make it possible to think and imagine otherwise. In his analysis of the role of the creative arts, while Matebeni explains that in observing the social processes, both past and present, they, that is the creative arts, reflect on extend perspectives in understanding reality by creating new maps of existence through ideas that not only generate, but also transcend existing possibilities and ways of apprehending those possibilities. In contributing to the common store of social, political, and moral ideas in society, they also become wellsprings of new ideas and new ways of thinking. Creative works make it possible to transcend the limitations imposed by official or officialized histories and narratives. Artistic works thus become a vital archival resource which offers alternative ways of creating knowledge on queer lived experiences on the continent. There's a vibrant and growing body of artistic works from different parts of the continent which attempt to offer representations of queer experiences on the continent in their rich diversity and complexities. I think in this instance of the first poem in Koleka, Putuma's groundbreaking anthology, Collective Amnesia. The poem is entitled Storytelling. This simple yet deeply evocative poem, composed of a title, Storytelling, and a footnote with 3 lines that read, "How my people remember, how my people archive, how we inherit the world," highlights the role that the creative plays in creating community, in imagining lived experiences that are often banished to the margins, and in archiving the same experiences. The 3 unpretentious statements in the footnote speak to how storytelling in its multifaceted forms is a way of creating memories, of making sense of the past, and particularly of imagining different futures and presents. This resonates perfectly with the thoughts of Abdel Attaya, the first openly gay Moroccan writer, who in his largely autobiographical novel, Une Mélancolie Arabe, an Arab melancholia, talks how storytelling is intricately linked to representing queer lives and giving them a dignified and worthy representation. According to Taya, storytelling is un espace réel mentale, pour oser se définir, dit tout, révéler tout. Et un jour, écrit tout, même l'amour interdit, l'écrit un nouveau nom, un nom digne, un poème. Storytelling is a real space, a mental space, which allows one to dare to redefine themselves, to say everything, even forbidden love, to write it with a new name, a worthy name, a poem. Abdullah Taya's rich body of literary and filmic narratives contribute a different, a fresh, and a worthwhile perspective that enriches and complements the burgeoning body of literary text that broach post-colonial queer experiences in North Africa and indeed Africa. In Abdullah Taya's storytelling, there's queer world making and imagining of new futures in a region of the African continent, which is often marginalized in queer African studies and African studies in general. I also find that Abdullah Taya's work enters into conversation with other brave storytelling embodied in contemporary films such as Ncube, The Wound, a South African film directed by John Trenkov, and Rafiki, a Kenyan film directed by Wanuri Kahui. Ncube and Rafiki function as popular social texts that position themselves in ways that enable them to ask important questions about queer lived experience on the continent. Although the films were initially banned by censorship boards in their respective countries of origin, their reception by viewers in and outside Africa has shown that they're capacious and that they have the capacity to engender conversations about issues relating to queer African gender and sexual identities. The very diverse reactions that these films elicited shows that audiences are more complex than governments might admit. Moreover, the reactions prove that the films engendered, especially in online spaces, show how creative works of fiction and storytelling, be they visual, musical, or literary, operate to shape queer lived experiences and responses to them. In evoking and thinking about these diverse artistic forms from different parts of the continent, I find that the works dialogue and converse amongst each other. They dialogue between geopolitical spaces, beyond cultural differences, and beyond linguistic expressions. In such a way, these works of art initiate important interregional and intra-continental conversations away from and beyond the regional specificities that are evident in African queer lived experiences. There's need to develop interregional and intercontinental as well as transcontinental dialogues. Keguro Macharia also attests that there is need to find commonalities that can help in enhancing our consideration of non-normative gender and sexual identities in Africa, in the African diaspora. Macharia clarifies that it is important to find how different people across multiple geohistories have co-imagined each other and attempted to create shareable worlds. Taiwo Osenubi also concedes that by expanding our focus beyond regional specificities, it is possible to substantiate our general considerations of broad-based, sustained, and inconvertible proliferation of African queer representation that deserve committed academic attention. I conclude this lecture by pointing out that considerable work still has to be done in order to articulate African queer subjectivities and experiences in their multifaceted complexities and vibrancies. Attend to inter-regional and intra-continental collaboration and dialogue, coupled with grounding knowledge production on African queerness, on lived experiences, as well as African modes of thinking and being, will undoubtedly yield new ways of thinking about and thinking through queer subjectivities and experiences on the African continent. I close this lecture by citing the words of Kenyan filmmaker Wanui Kahui, who ponders, imagine if we have images of Africans who are more vibrant and loving and thriving and living a beautiful, vibrant life. What would we think of ourselves? I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Gibson. Your own work, of course, and this lecture is part of that creation of archive that you talk about, Koleka Putuma's beautiful poem, but your work and this very lecture that will be archived is part of that labor, part of that work. A number of really wonderful questions have come through. And what I will do is to sort of guide us through the questions, but trying to keep a thread of argument going through. And I just wanted to, point to mention the image from your lecture that I thought was so evocative, and that is the festering finger. What is the festering finger pointing to? What is it a manifestation of? Like a malady that needs to be interpreted. What is the malady? So the questions come in sort of two sets. And one set has to do with the tensions between diasporic identities and, shall I call it, at-home identities. So they've sort of a number of questions that relate to that. And then another set of questions that have to do with terminology and with locatedness of knowledge. For example, whether the term queer is a universal word that one would want to use everywhere, or whether these are in fact words from a kind of, if you like, global discourse that don't always fit in all settings. If you like, I can read one or two of the questions out, unless you want to say a few general words before we get to more specific questions. How would you prefer it to go?
We can go straight to the questions.
Let's do that. Some of the questions are rather long, but I will read some of the shorter ones first. Quite a number of African queer creative works have been produced by artists in the diaspora. How do you see the role between artists on the continent and in the diaspora? And then a second layer between academics on the continent and in the diaspora. And that is a question from Adrian van Klinken. And I wonder, that's maybe a good one to start with, to sort of sift for us how you see these relations operating.
Thank you very much for that question. I do find that there's interesting conversation between what creative artists are doing on one hand and what academics are also doing on the other. So the creative is mainly concerned with representing, making visible queer lived experiences on the continent. And what the academics are doing is trying to think through ideas of queerness in Africa. And I think creating or theorizing queer in Africa. So there's rich conversations, I think, between the creative and the academic, which lead to very productive and very worthwhile conversations on different issues in the scholastic domain of the queer in Africa. Sorry, Kali, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. Sorry. There's a question, and I'm not sure where this person is located. Kaman Minilo or Zaman Minilo, I don't know which. The material Ncube shared was very interesting. Does he have recommendations of Zimbabwean artists doing queer audiovisual art? That is a delicious question. Are there, would you share some names with us, please?
Unfortunately, I don't think I'm able to share any because there are not any that come to my mind right now, except
so I think
for a literature.
Pauline, if you are there, could you type some in the answer box? Sorry, Gibson, please go ahead.
So what does come to my mind is a single novel by Tendai Huchu, The Headdress of Harare, which I think currently stands as a single work of art that broaches queer sexualities in Zimbabwe.
Thank you very much. Let me just see if Pauline Matebeni is in the audience. Pauline, if you can hear me, please would you type, this is Pauline's work sort of overlaps and complements your work. So maybe someone else could answer that question. We can collectively answer. Thank you, Gibson. Let me see another question. Tabo Mabuka, a brilliant presentation. I had a question. Please, can you tell us what you think needs to be done in the education systems in Africa to generate conversations about queerness? Or where does the topic fit into the current system?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that interesting question. I'm actually currently working on a paper on queering the African education system, on queering the African academy as well. And I think there's lots of work that needs to be done to, I think, open up discourses even as early as primary schools, for example, on issues that have to do with queer identities in Africa. So I think those should not be taboo subjects at all, and that the school, which is supposed to be an area of learning, of opening up thoughts, should also be open to discussing with students these different ideas. So I think lots of work does need still to be done in terms of queering the education system in Africa.
So Pauline Matebeni has come up with some answers there. If you look in the question, in the, where are we? In the chat box. And Pauline, I hope this motivates you to finish your article very soon. There's a hunger for the knowledge that you're producing. Thank you very much for those, for the answers in the chat box. Gibson, there's another question. You are, as I said in my introduction as well, you are fairly unique in working across English, French, and what other epistemic language traditions do you work in? I hear your Xhosa pronunciation is perfect, so I'm imagining there's a number of other languages in your head. If you can talk to us about working across linguistic and cultural traditions, and what that means for your work. How does the festering finger fit into this multiverse?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I think the scholarly traditions in Africa have vastly been divided between the Anglophone and the Francophone, and there is need, I think, to bridge this divide, creating conversations between these different geographic and also linguistic spaces which I think have been influenced mainly by colonial traditions as well. And it's also interesting to note that vastly different debates and conversations that are happening in these diverse linguistic spaces, and also that the cultural productions in these different linguistic spaces are also vastly different. So if you take a look at the Anglophone world, the kinds of cultural productions are more daring, they're more open in their depiction of queer lived experiences. I'm thinking in this instance of films like Ncube or Rafiki, and a very wide body of other South African films and novels. These are very direct and very open in their depiction of queer lived experiences. And this is not necessarily the case if you consider, for example, North Africa, Francophone North Africa in particular, where the depiction of queer lived experiences is often covered up. It's not open. So you'd need to really read and look in between the lines to discover, as it were, these queer lived experiences in this part of the African continent. So I think the colonial traditions and the linguistic differences have engendered different cultural productions and also different kinds of conversations that are happening. And as I pointed out, there is need to bridge these two different divides and to enter into inter-African or intercontinental dialogues that focus on queer lived experiences on the continent.
Thank you so much. And, to go back to Adrian's question and to interpret it slightly, it seems to me also that the festering finger means different things in different contexts. So, for example, in a special issue for a journal, the editor might be asking one to use certain terminology that you simply know does not fit in the context in which you are producing knowledge or into which you are writing. And so that one, it seems to me that with queer studies, very often it brings questions to the surface around competing epistemologies. And I slightly want to take issue with the fact of it being an emerging field. Maybe it's just where I circulate, but I do think that it really, in the last few years, has become an extremely visible area in African studies generally. I don't know if you want to comment on that or just confirm your sense that it is the same.
Well, I think normally the comparison is between Africa and the global north, and that compared to the global north, queer studies in Africa, for example, is still in its nascent stages. And I think that might not be true, because I think there's a very rich body of scholarly work, of cultural productions that has been coming out of the continent, dating back the past 2 decades or so.
There's a rather long question that I'm trying to summarize from Matthew Nelson, quite poetically expressed, but let me try and just come up with a prosaic version of it, that queer eroticism as a site of solidarity and resistance against persistent global homophobia between the West and Africa. Let me see. To what extent might conceptions of queer eroticism be a site of solidarity and resistance? Can it be?
Thank you for that question, Matthew. I think there is definitely need to think beyond Africa and to look at global queer community and how conversing without the continent is important in creating or making queer world making. So there is definitely need to think beyond Africa and to also integrate these different epistemologies, the spiritual, the cultural, I think, in creating these discourses and these conversations which are long overdue, I think. So there is need to think transcontinentally in creating knowledge on queer experiences, be it in Africa or the African diaspora.
And I mean, maybe following from that also, where is one's investment? Where is the conversation that you are moving along? It seems to me sort of, you know, Kampala seems to be a site, a located site from where knowledge is produced. But then, of course, also there's sites across the West or the North, whatever one wants to call it, that compete for that. There's a question from Dorothée Boulanger. Isn't this discourse much more emerged in Anglophone than in Francophone and Lusophone Africa?
I think it's very true that there's a wider body of queer scholarship from Anglophone Africa, South Africa in particular, than is the case from Francophone and Lusophone Africa. And one might think of the South African, for example, constitution, which is quite liberal in the way it protects queer rights, and how this has created a space in which there's more scholarship and there's more cultural protection in relating to different queer subjectivities.
So we have another question from Adrian van Klinken, a very Adrianish question. If there's time for another question, it appears to me that in order to Africanize queer studies, it's important to engage with religious and spiritual traditions and practices and their productive links to queerness. So I mean, from Adrian's work, we also know that religion in Africa is one of those places where the festering finger points in different directions. Productive links to queerness, rather than seeing religion as the source of queerphobia. Do you have any thoughts about this, specifically in relation to Taya's writing that you quoted for us? Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you for that question. It's very right, particularly in this case, that Islam is not queerphobic, and that compared to other religions, like Christianity, Islam is actually more permissive of queer sexualities, and that what you have rather are cultural practices that appropriate religion to move certain ideas of what is deemed correct and what is deemed incorrect ways of, for example, expressing one's sexuality. So definitely, it's very productive to look beyond the framing of religion as being the source of queerphobia and looking at how different factors work towards creating homophobia or different kinds of phobia, queerphobia.
Thank you, Gibson. There have been a few questions also about the beautiful voice of Nakane. So I'd seen him in Ncube, but I had not heard him sing. What a versatile and wide-ranging voice. Could you say a few words maybe about Nakane's reception? Because he's not South African born, is he?
He's South African born.
Oh, he is South African born. Can you?
Yeah, sure. So Nakane has a very rich body of music to begin with, and he's got 3, I think, albums so far that deal with different queer subjects in South Africa. And he's also written a book called Piggy Boys Blues. And recently he was also involved in the film Ncube. And I think because of reactions to the film Ncube, he was compelled to leave South Africa and to move to the UK. So I think this speaks at times to how even in the most liberal countries like South Africa, where the constitution protects queer rights, cultural and lived experiences point differently. So there's a very huge disjuncture between the law and the lived experiences, and that the law does not necessarily translate to individuals who identify as queer living a peaceful or a good life in a space like South Africa.
Thank you very much. It is such a pleasure to see so many names of people that I know are dialing in from Southern Africa. So normally with this lecture, we would have been in a hall somewhere in London, and just such a different experience to be able to beam it out to a different audience. It gives us different ways of thinking about how we want to do our business. Any other questions coming from the audience, or something you want to ask, maybe Gibson?
I have no questions in particular, no.
Anyone else in the audience who wants to ask another question? We've made Gibson work hard, but if there's one more question, we can take one more. Let me see, a question from Jane Creamer. Okay. She's currently writing an MA dissertation on the power of storytelling. In some reading, she says, I come across the argument that stories enhance visibility for queer individuals, and that this enhanced visibility leads to increased violence. So what is your stance on increased visibility? And actually, it's something that one thinks about also for authors. Inviting authors to contribute raises their visibility too. So if you can generally talk to us, thank you for that question, about issues of being brought to visibility and the ambiguities of that.
Yep, thank you for that question. I'm thinking, for example, of the kinds of visibility that Nakane got after the launch of the film Ncube, and how that visibility led to very violent demonstrations by traditional Xhosa men who felt that their secret rights of ulwaluko were being broadcast to the world, and that by inserting queer into this very ritual space, what Nakane and the film were doing was to put their culture into very bad disrepute. So there is a very close link between visibility and normally very kinds of violent reactions to different ways of work that are created by not just queer artists, but also by scholars who work in the field of queer studies as well. So there is a very intricate link between visibility and violent reactions, which is quite sad, I think.
Well, and it raises ethical questions also for us as scholars about what we bring into visibility. For example, in scholarship on social media, to name the people one is writing about or to make them identifiable comes with all sorts of risks for the people we write about. Thank you for that, Gibson. Any further questions or admiring comments? I think there's one more new question from Ncube. Curious about the psychology of queerness in Africa, particularly in terms of generational trauma outcomes of diverse colonial consequences in different African spaces. Do you want me to read it again? It's a complicated question, or can you see it, Gibson?
Could you repeat it, please?
Ncube writes that they are curious about the psychology of queerness in Africa, particularly in terms of the generational trauma outcomes of diverse colonial consequences in different African spaces. So I guess asking you to draw the link between being colonized and queerness and how those intersect in complicated ways?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting and difficult question, I think. But I think of this in Koleka Putuma's collection of novels, Collective Amnesia, and how it's very difficult to collectively forget these different traumas from the past, and that it's important to, if I can say, to deal with these ghosts from the past in thinking of different futures and new futures. So the traumas cannot be forgotten. We cannot claim amnesia on these traumas. There's need to deal with them, to face these ghosts and these phantoms, and to be able to think beyond the trauma and to create better and new futures.
I can see Koleka Putuma on the shelf behind you, watching over you. You've turned the face of the book into the room, watching you create new archives as you speak. There's another question that goes back to the Amanpour clip about where, I guess, what the zone is of queer identity. If it's a private zone, or in other words, beyond the concerns of the state, as the president expressed it, beyond the rights of citizens, or if it's something that actually exists in the public realm in that sense.
I'm wondering how human rights can ever be privatized or made a private issue. So if people's rights, human rights, speak to what they do in their everyday lives, in who they are in everyday life, I'm not too sure how those can be privatized or rendered private.
Mm. Mm.
Mm.
I'm just struck also by, during the pandemic, how much more of our privacy has been on display. So, today you and I have seen each other in our houses. Now we're in your office, and just the vulnerability that one has often had to display by people coming into our homes in ways that would never have happened. So that to reinterpret that question in another way, I think that COVID has given us new intimacies, but it's also invaded our spaces in ways that are often uncomfortable.
Yeah, definitely.
Gibson, would you like to take one more question, or do you feel you've reached a good point to end this?
One more question would be okay.
Let me see. Is there another question in the room? Boulanger, just thank you so much. Wonderful, illuminating. Maybe my question can be, can you tell us about your future work? Tell us about this monograph, which we can't wait to read. What is it you're working on?
So what I'm working on is on queer bodies as they are displayed in different African films. And so my argument is that the queer has often been rendered invisible, and that what has to be done is to look at the body itself, or the screened body, as a text which is readable and legible. And so what I do is to offer different readings of different films and how the body is framed in film, and how this speaks to different ideas on what it means to be queer in Africa, what it means to inhabit spaces in Africa, and to also, I think, looking, for example, at the skin, how the skin can be seen as a site through which to read intimacy on one hand, how it speaks to vulnerability as well, and how it also speaks to queer visibility. So So these are some of the ideas that I'm working on in this monograph.
Wonderful. So it's very much developing on the arguments in your article in Journal of African Cultural Studies.
Yes, definitely.
Fantastic. Can't wait to read it. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for doing it. And thank you so very much for agreeing to be one of the MKZ lecturers this year, and for sending us your beautiful lecture, and for sharing your thoughts and responses tonight. And maybe, is this a practice? I don't think we can switch on everyone's screen, so I'll just have to applaud on behalf of everyone. Thank you very much, Gibson. Thank you so much for doing this.
It was an extreme pleasure for me. Thank you so much, Kali.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who attended. I think we can stop the recording now.